He's good. He won't hurt me. These were the last words Dasha Perevoshikova said to her sister about her new boyfriend. A few months later, they would be searching for her all over St. Petersburg for an entire month. And the man she described with those words would never face punishment. To understand how such a thing is even possible, one must go back to the summer of 2024. Dasha was 28 years old. Friends called her Dora. She worked as a barber in St. Petersburg, cutting men's hair in a rockabilly style. Fades, pompadours, 1950s classics. Since the age of 17, she had been independent. She rented a chair in a barber shop, managed her own appointments, and decided herself how much to charge for a haircut. She was a person accustomed to relying only on herself and taking responsibility for her own decisions. At some point, a man messaged her on Instagram, Evgeny Andreev, 36 years old. Not just some cobbler from a stall near the metro, a master of premium footwear. Salvatore Ferragamo, Chanel, Louis Vuitton. People brought him bags worth hundreds of thousands, shoes that cost as much as her monthly earnings, and he knew exactly how to handle them. Two people who worked with their hands, two masters of their craft. That was exactly what brought them together. The first few weeks went exactly by the book. Flowers, meeting her at home after work, morning texts, evening calls, a classic candy and bouquet period in its purest form. Dasha talked about him to her sister Aliona, who was living in Italy at the time, but they spoke constantly on the phone. Aliona would ask, "Well, how is he? Is he normal?" And Dasha would reply, "He's good. He won't hurt me." And at first impression, Evgeny really did seem that way. Quiet, introverted, not the type to seek the center of attention. He spoke little and listened a lot. For Dasha, who was used to loud and empty people, this seemed like an absolute plus. She didn't check his past, didn't question his exes, didn't dig through his social media. Why, if the person beside her was acting completely normally? By autumn, they were a couple. They saw each other almost every day. She would visit him, he would visit her. The relationship developed quickly, but without any pressure. From the outside, it seemed like everything was going exactly as it should. However, Dasha didn't know the most important thing. Her new boyfriend had already left a certain trail behind him, a trail of lies and broken people. And the first alarm bell would ring very soon. A few weeks into the relationship, Evgeny told Dasha a story intended to evoke sympathy. He claimed a tragedy had happened with his brother, that he had taken his own life. And now Evgeny needed to rush to Volgograd for the funeral. Dasha, of course, was supportive and didn't ask unnecessary questions. The man was already suffering, so why push? Before leaving, Evgeny asked acquaintances for money for the trip and for all those sad expenses. People gave, some 5,000, some more. It was a normal story. A person in trouble, you have to help. He returned a few days later, depressed, silent. Dasha attributed this to grief, and from the outside, it all looked logical. As it would later be revealed, the brother was alive. No funeral ever existed. The money went who knows where. It was a lie, calculated, detailed, with emotions in the right places and the right pauses. Dasha never found out. Or perhaps she found out and chose not to give it importance. Now, you can no longer ask her. At the same time, problems began at the workshop. Evgeny's clients, the ones with the expensive bags and shoes, started to complain. The pattern repeated the same way every time. He took an item for repair, took a deposit, and set a deadline. The deadline passed, then another. Evgeny didn't answer calls, rescheduled meetings, or simply vanished. One woman waited for her Salvatore Ferragamo bag for a month, then 2, then 3. The bag lay untouched. The story with the Chanel shoes ended exactly the same way. The landlord of the premises saw what was happening. The workshop, which used to look like a normal workspace, was gradually turning into a warehouse. Other people's belongings on the shelves, dust, trash in the corners. Evgeny appeared less and less frequently. He took the money, but didn't do the work. People were angry, demanding their items back. Some threatened the police. He would nod, promise, and disappear again. From the outside, it looked like a crisis, a person failing to cope, a difficult period, it happens. But if you looked at the whole picture, a clear pattern emerged. Lies for profit, manipulation through pity, promises made without the slightest intention of keeping them, and a complete lack of consequences, because every time he found new people who believed him. Dasha was one of them. She saw an attentive boyfriend who met her after work and gave her flowers. She didn't see the man who lied to acquaintances about the funeral of a living brother. Then, in the autumn of 2024, the situation changed. The owners of the apartment where Dasha lived announced they were selling it, and she had to move out urgently. Her father offered to pay for a hostel for the first few weeks so she could look for a new place in peace. She refused. She said briefly, "I'll move in with him." And from that moment, a completely different story began. An apartment on Mozhaiskaya Street, an old building, high ceilings, a bay window overlooking a courtyard well. It sounded like a St. Petersburg classic, the kind usually shown in beautiful reels about the city's atmosphere. In reality, it was a dilapidated home. Formerly, 2 rooms, but only one was habitable. The second was just empty. No one spent time there. There was no real kitchen at all, just a corner with a stove and a sink. The furniture was old. No repairs had been made for years. And it all looked nothing like what one would expect from a master of premium footwear. Dasha decided to settle in. Since she was living there, she wanted it to be decent. During one of her trips to Georgia, she bought a kitchen set, inexpensive but high quality, and asked Evgeny to assemble it while she was away. She returned a week later. The kitchen sat in boxes, untouched. Evgeny explained something about being busy, about not having enough time. Dasha didn't argue. She found a craftsman herself and paid for the assembly herself. And that was the first warning bell. Not a lie, not a manipulation, but simple inaction. A man living in the apartment could not assemble a kitchen for the woman who had moved in with him. Then she started noticing other things. Evgeny almost never worked. The workshop existed only nominally. He would drop by but didn't take orders. Or he took them and didn't fulfill them. The money from the remaining clients went who knows where. Dasha, meanwhile, worked every day. Her schedule was full, her clients constant. She earned a stable and decent income. It was enough for 2. This became the problem. Evgeny got used to it. Food in the fridge, Dasha bought it. Utility bills, Dasha paid them. Household trifles, Dasha solved them. He just lived nearby, smoking, drinking beer, sitting on his phone. The balance in the couple shifted completely. She was the provider. He was the one being provided for. Dasha realized this and told her friends that she was tired of dragging a person along. But there was nowhere to go. She had lost her own housing. Renting separately was expensive, and she didn't want to return to her father. He lived in Kiev, a different country, a different life. And so, she found herself in a trap. Not a physical one, but a domestic one. A dependence on housing that belonged to a person she could no longer rely on. The relationship continued by inertia. Joint evenings, conversations, all that was there. Now inside, something had broken. Dasha started thinking about an exit. Not a sudden break, but a plan. How to leave without ending up on the street. How to build life anew. How to do it right. And then she had an idea that matured with every trip to the same place. A city she liked more than St. Petersburg. A city where she felt free. Tbilisi. During 2024, Dasha went there several times. At first just to see. Everyone was going, why not? Then she returned again. And again. The city truly hooked her. The narrow streets of the old center, balconies with carved railings, people who are in no hurry, and prices you can live on, not just survive on. After St. Petersburg, with its grey sky and eternal race, it felt like a completely different planet. At some point, Dasha found a brand there that made handmade corsets. She wanted to learn, not to quit barbering, but to add something new. She knew how to work with her hands. She only had to master the technique. The masters agreed to take her for training, and this was already a concrete plan, not just dreams of moving. She also made friends there. Locals, expats, other newcomers from Russia. People she could talk to not about problems, but about plans for the future. For Tbilisi, Dasha felt like a person with prospects. In St. Petersburg, she felt like a person dragging someone else's life and household behind her. The decision formed itself. She would move. Not someday, not in an abstract future, but in the coming months. She needed money, documents, preparation. But it could all be done if she acted consistently. Dasha started saving, specifically in cash. It seemed more reliable. She set aside money from every haircut, not in an account, not on a card, but in an envelope. The money was kept at home. She knew exactly how much was there and counted it regularly. Her cat also needed to be moved. So Dasha was arranging veterinary documents and looking up the rules for importing animals. A small detail, but an important one, because she had no intention of leaving her pet behind. Friends knew about the plan. She told them, "I want to leave. I want to start over." Some asked, "What about Evgeny?" Dasha answered simply, "Ideally together. If he refuses, I'll go alone." It wasn't an ultimatum, just a statement of fact. She was no longer building her life around a man. She was building it around herself. He could join or stay. It was his choice. By December, the plan was almost ready. Money saved, documents gathered. Only the last thing remained, the conversation. To tell Evgeny that she was leaving and that their relationship in its current form no longer suited her. Dasha chose the moment. After the New Year holidays, they would celebrate quietly, just the two of them, and then there would be a serious talk. It seemed like the right way. But in December, Evgeny told her something, and that talk had to be postponed. December 2024. Evgeny came home and said his mother was gone, and he needed to go to Volgograd immediately for the funeral. Dasha saw his state, depressed, barely speaking, sitting on his phone, smoking one cigarette after another. A person in grief. That's exactly what it looked like from the outside. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't pry, didn't demand details. She supported him as best she could. The The conversation about breaking up had to be delayed. How could you leave someone who had just lost their closest relative? It would be too cruel. Evgeny left and returned a few days later, even more withdrawn than before. Dasha endured it, gave him space, didn't push, and waited for him to feel better. She didn't know that this was already the second invented tragedy in a few months. The same scenario: grief, the sympathy of others, a trip to Volgograd, and a lie that no one checked. Evgeny's mother was alive, as was his brother. Why he did this is still unclear. Money? Perhaps he was asking someone for it again. Manipulation? So that Dasha wouldn't leave, so her pity would outweigh her accumulated fatigue. Or simply habit, because lying was easier than explaining why he was the way he was. Meanwhile, his affairs were going downhill. At the beginning of December, Evgeny appeared at the workshop. The landlord saw him. He asked for a payment deferral and looked exhausted. After that, he vanished and never returned. The workshop stood closed, and other people's belongings still lay inside. People called, demanding their items back, but he didn't answer. Dasha didn't know about this. Or she knew partially, but didn't understand the scale. She saw a man grieving the loss of his mother. She didn't see a man deceiving everyone around him, including her. There was something else, and it would only come to light after everything was over. Evgeny had an ex-girlfriend, and after the breakup, he hadn't let her go. He wrote, called, stalked, and blackmailed her. She would tell Dasha's father about this later, when it was already too late. If Dasha had known this earlier, perhaps everything would have turned out differently. But she didn't know. Less than 2 weeks remained until the new year, end of December. A classmate came to Dasha for a haircut, someone she hadn't seen in a long time. But they had kept in touch, messaging and occasionally calling. He booked as a regular client, sat in the chair, and Dasha began to work. They got to talking, and he immediately noticed she looked tired. Not physically, but somehow internally, as if something was pressing from within. He asked how things were, and Dasha answered honestly, without filters, without trying to pretend everything was fine. "I'm done," she said. "Enough. I can't do it anymore." And then she told him about Evgeny, about how tired she was of slaving away every day and dragging along a person who does nothing. "He's like a parasite to me." That's exactly how she formulated it. The classmate listened and didn't interrupt. Dasha spoke as if she had wanted to say this to someone for a long time, to vent, to speak aloud what had been spinning in her head for months and giving her no peace. And then she said the most important thing. The decision was made. After the holidays, there would be a conversation. She would leave him, move to Tbilisi, and start everything anew. It wasn't an emotion or a flash of anger. It was the calm, considered decision of a person tired of waiting for something to change on its own. She no longer hoped for change. She was simply preparing for her exit. The classmate left after the haircut. They said goodbye normally, as usual. He didn't know then that he would be the last person, besides Evgeny, to see Dasha alive. This would become clear only later, when the search began. She and Evgeny planned to see in the new year together, quietly, without guests, without noisy companies. Both were taking antidepressants, so they didn't intend to drink alcohol. Just sit at home, wait out the holiday, and then deal with what had accumulated between them. She didn't know that the conversation would happen earlier. and it would end in a way she never planned. December 31st was already tomorrow, and that day would become the turning point in this entire story. No, Dasha didn't realize that yet. She thought she was in control of the situation, that the plan would work, that she would simply survive the holidays and leave. She failed to account for one thing. The man she was planning to leave had already lost people before, and every time that happened, he didn't let them go easily. December 31st, morning. Dasha decided to clean the apartment before the holiday. Wipe the dust, organize things, bring some kind of order. It was New Year's, after all. At least let it be clean at home, even if everything else in her life didn't look festive right now. She moved through the rooms, moving things, wiping surfaces, and at some point reached into where the money was kept. The very money she had been saving for months for Georgia and a new life. And that was when she realized some of the money was missing. Dasha counted it. She counted it again. The amount didn't add up. There weren't many options, if you thought about it. 2 people in the apartment. She didn't take the money. Therefore, he did. No other explanation existed. Dasha went out to Evgeny and asked directly, without preparation, "Where is the money?" He began to say something, to deny it, to explain. But she was no longer listening. Everything that had built up inside over these months, the silence, the patience, the attempts to ignore the obvious, the hopes that he would change, it all burst out in a single flood. She screamed. She said what she had wanted to say for a long time, but had held back. About how she supported him like a dependent. Oh, the lying, the workshop, sitting closed. About how that was it. Enough. She couldn't and wouldn't do it anymore. "I'm leaving. I'm moving out. This is the end." It wasn't the conversation she had planned. Not a calm, weighed explanation after the holidays, but an explosion. Everything she had intended to say carefully and point by point poured out now, through emotion, through screaming, without a plan and without control over the situation. Months of accumulated tension compressed into a few minutes, and those minutes changed everything. Evgeny listened in silence. Then he stood up and left the room without answering. Dasha remained alone, angry, empty, and perhaps even feeling some relief because she had finally said it. Finally voiced it all aloud, no longer keeping it inside. She didn't see where he went. She didn't see what he was doing in the next room. She stood with her back to the door and, likely, thought about what would happen next, how she would pack her things, where she would go first. On the floor in the next room lay a mallet, a joiner's mallet with a rubber head, a tool for working with wood or leather, heavy, comfortable, fitting perfectly in the hand. Evgeny picked it up. He wanted her to be quiet. And from that moment on, Dasha Perevoshchikova's story would cease to be a story about a failed relationship and become something else entirely. The first blow fell on the back of her head. Dasha was standing with her back turned and didn't see it coming, didn't expect anything of the sort. The mallet, heavy and blunt, slammed into her skull with such force that she immediately screamed and turned around. Blood flowed down her hair, down her neck, onto her shoulders. She raised her hands, trying to cover herself, but he struck again and again. Dasha fell and continued to scream, calling for help. The neighbors through the wall, if they heard anything, didn't react. It was a holiday, December 31st. Maybe they thought it was a drunken quarrel. Maybe the TV was louder than usual. Evgeny tossed the mallet aside, grabbed her throat with his hands, and began to squeeze. He pressed until she was wheezing and thrashing beneath him. Then he let go. Dasha was still alive. She was breathing. Blood was flowing heavily from her head and wouldn't stop, but she looked at him and said, "Let's talk," calmly, as if something could still be fixed, as if this were just a quarrel that could be resolved with words. They sat on the sofa, side by side, she in blood, with her head split open, he, the one who did it. Dasha asked him to call an ambulance. She said, "I feel bad. I'm bleeding out, please." Evgeny was silent and didn't move. He didn't reach for the phone. He just sat beside her and watched. Then he stood up, took a tie, his own, a regular one hanging nearby, looped it around her neck, and tightened it. She resisted, but more weakly than the first time. Her strength was leaving her along with the blood. He held it until she went limp, then let go and went into the kitchen to smoke. From the room came a sound, a groan, a wheeze. She was alive. After the mallet, after the manual strangulation, after the tie, she was still breathing. He returned, took a rope or a belt. The investigation would determine which later. Tied her hands, tied her feet, and tied her to the radiator so she couldn't move. Then he took a shirt, crumpled it up, and pressed it to Dasha's face, over her mouth and nose simultaneously. He held it until she stopped moving, stopped making sounds, stopped breathing. 3 attempts. The mallet, the hands, the tie with the shirt. And here is what is important to understand. Every time, he could have stopped. Every time, she was still alive and asking for help. Every time, he made the choice to continue. This was not a flash of rage or a momentary blur that lawyers would later talk about. This was a methodical, consistent action, with pauses, with smoke breaks in the kitchen, with a return to finish what he started. In the room stood a decorated Christmas tree, the garland blinking with colorful lights, and there were only a few hours left until the new year. Dasha lay on the floor next to that tree, in the apartment where she had planned to celebrate the holiday, in the city she had wanted to leave so badly and had almost succeeded in doing so. She was 28 years old, and it was the last day of her life. She lay on the floor, and he remained in the apartment. He didn't call the police, didn't call anyone, didn't try to flee or even leave. He simply stayed right where everything had happened, as if it were a normal night and nothing special had occurred. And the first thing he did after all this was take her phone, unlock it, open her banking app, and transfer 12,500 rubles to his own card. Everything that remained in the account. Then he ordered food, from her phone through her app. The delivery arrived. He took the order, paid with her card, and ate. In the same apartment where Dasha lay on the floor in the next room. This is not a creative exaggeration or an attempt to darken the colors. This is what the investigation would later establish through the history of transactions and orders. The investigation would also pull up the browser history for that evening. Search queries he had typed. One began with the words, "Can you die from?" followed by something related to consequences. The query was either not finished or not fully saved. And another, how to tie a girl with ropes. The second query might have been made afterward, when he was tying her up to finish her off. Or before, which would mean he was preparing in advance. The investigation would never establish the exact time of these queries, but the very fact of their existence says a lot. At midnight, Dasha's phone rang. her sister's number. Aliona was calling from Italy, and it had been their tradition for many years. Every New Year, exactly at 12 o'clock Moscow time, they would call each other, wish each other a Happy New Year, talk for a few minutes, laugh, share wishes and plans for the next year. A mandatory ritual that neither of them ever missed. This time, no one answered. Aliona called again, and again. 8 calls in a row, one after another. She wrote on WhatsApp, on Telegram, on Instagram, on every messenger there was. Silence. Not a single reply, not a single message read. Aliona didn't panic, at least not immediately. She thought maybe the phone had died. It happens. Maybe Dasha fell asleep early because she was tired after work. Maybe she was celebrating so well she just didn't hear the calls. There could be any number of reasons. She'll call back tomorrow and everything will be cleared up. Aliona went to sleep. In Italy, the new year was already beginning, and she didn't know that her sister was gone. At that time in St. Petersburg, in the apartment on Mozhaiskaya Street, Evgeny Andreev was seeing in the holiday alone. Exactly what he did that night, the investigation would never establish. Did he drink? Smoke in the kitchen? Sit on his phone scrolling through feeds? Sleep in the next room? No one knows, and, likely, no one will ever know. Only one thing is known. He didn't go anywhere. He didn't flee, didn't try to get rid of the evidence, didn't call anyone for help or advice. He simply stayed in the apartment and spent the entire New Year's night there. On the 1st of January, Aliona received a message from Dasha, or rather from Dasha's phone, though at the time she, of course, didn't know it and couldn't have known. The text was simple and quite logical. Sorry I didn't answer. We had such a romantic New Year's that I wasn't checking my phone. Aliona read it and smiled. She was happy for her sister, thinking that maybe things had worked out between them. Maybe that difficult period had finally passed. It happens in relationships. They fight, they make up, and love flares up again, sometimes even stronger than before. She replied with something warm, congratulated her again, and wrote that she was happy for them both. But it wasn't Dasha responding on the other end. On the other end sat the man who, 12 hours earlier, had taken her sister's life. And now he was typing messages, carefully choosing words that were supposed to sound plausible and not arouse any suspicion. Friends also noticed changes, but didn't immediately understand what had changed. Dora, as her close friends called her, always wrote first. She'd ask how things were, send memes, send voice messages several minutes long. She was the kind of person who kept in touch constantly and didn't wait for someone else to write first. After the new year, this stopped. She responded, but only to incoming messages. Briefly, dryly, without voice messages, without jokes, without her usual style of communication. Busy? Everything's fine. I'll tell you later. Her friends attributed this to the holidays, to being tired after a big night, to the fact that she was with her boyfriend and wanted to be together without being distracted by messaging. Logical and understandable. Nothing scary about that. Soon she'd return to her normal routine and everything would be as before. On the 8th or 9th of January, another message came, going to a concert. And a post appeared on Dasha's Instagram, a photo from some performance. Music, a crowd, stage lights, a living image from a living life intended to convince everyone that she was fine. Anxiety, if anyone had any, finally receded after that. The person is going to concerts. posting photos, sharing impressions. It means everything is normal. It means she's just busy with her own things. Nobody knew where Evgeny had gotten that photo. Had he found it in her gallery among old shots? Downloaded it from the web? Asked someone to send it under some pretext? The investigation would never establish this. No, what is important is something else. He perfectly understood what he was doing. He wasn't just mechanically answering incoming messages to buy time. He was consciously creating the illusion of life. For 3 weeks, he played this game. From Dasha's phone, he spoke with her sister, who lived in Italy and couldn't just drop by to check. With her friends, who were used to communicating via messengers and saw no reason for concern. With the people who loved her and were waiting for word from her. He answered their questions, calmed them down when someone started to worry, and joked when they asked something specific. And all that time, for all those 3 weeks, a few meters away from him, in that same apartment on Mozhaiskaya Street, Dasha lay, and he lived there, slept, ate, went out somewhere, and came back. Mid-January, Artyom, Dasha's colleague at the barbershop, began to notice something strange. Clients were coming for their appointments. People who had booked time in advance, as usual, through Instagram or by phone. They arrived at the scheduled hour, but she wasn't there. Artyom wrote to her, asking, "Where are you? People are waiting. They booked in advance." Replies came back. "I'm sick. I can't come. I have a bad cold." And this was strange. Not because barbers don't get sick. They do, of course, like everyone else. Something else was strange. Dasha never left her clients like that without warning. If she knew she wasn't coming, she cancelled appointments in advance, wrote to people personally, apologized, and rescheduled. It was a matter of reputation and professionalism. She took it seriously. Now, nothing of the sort was happening. The appointments stayed in the schedule. People arrived and waited, and she simply replied with one word, "sick." And that was it. No explanations, no apologies to clients. Artyom thought that maybe something truly serious had happened to her health. The flu, a high fever, lying flat and unable to get up. It happens, especially in winter. He didn't pry. He decided to wait. Dasha's father also felt that something was going wrong, though he couldn't formulate it specifically. Vladimir Perevoschikov lived far away, but he always kept in touch with his daughter and tried to maintain their relationship. They had planned to meet during the holidays, to go skating together, then to some concert. They had spoken before the new year and agreed on the details. After the holidays, he wrote to her, "Well, when are we meeting, as we planned?" The reply didn't come immediately, and it was very short. "I got sick. I can't go anywhere." Vladimir asked, "Maybe you need help? Maybe I should bring medicine or some groceries?" The reply was just as laconic. "No, everything's fine. I'll just sleep it off and get better." Vladimir reread these messages several times, and something about them scratched at him from the inside. The words seemed like hers, but the tone was somehow foreign, not the way it usually was. He would later tell investigators, "It was strange. Our style of communication is a bit different." This feeling wouldn't let him go, and he decided to call. Not her, but Evgeny. He found his number in old messages and dialed. Evgeny answered, and his voice sounded calm, even without any tension. He said, "Yes, Dasha is sick. She's lying at home. The fever is staying high, but it's nothing serious, just a bad cold. She'll be better soon and will call everyone back herself." Vladimir asked. "Let me speak to her. I want to hear her voice. Just a few words." A pause on the other end of the line. Then the answer. "No, she's sleeping now. I don't want to wake her. She needs rest. She'll call you back later when she wakes up." She didn't call back. Not later that day. Not the next day. Not several days later. Only messages continued to arrive. Short, dry. Vladimir didn't go to check in person. He didn't call the police, not yet. He told himself, "My daughter is an adult. She's 28. She makes her own decisions. If she says everything is fine, then it is. There's no need to panic and make a scene over a cold." But the feeling of anxiety wouldn't go away. Something was wrong. He felt it on some intuitive level, but couldn't explain it to himself or anyone else. The apartment on Mojaiskaya Street, the third week of January. Neighbors in the building began to notice a smell that was seeping out from somewhere behind the wall. At first, it was faint, as if something had spoiled in the fridge, or the trash hadn't been taken out on time. A common thing for communal apartments and old buildings where walls are thin. Ventilation is shared, and other people's smells have long been part of daily life. No one paid much attention to it because such things had happened before. But after a few days, it became impossible to ignore. The smell intensified and changed. It became heavy, sweetish, unlike anything from ordinary household experience. You couldn't mistake it for spoiled food or a forgotten trash bag. It was of a completely different nature. One of the neighbors went to the door of that apartment and knocked. No one opened. They knocked again, louder. Silence in response. No movement behind the door, no sounds. And then a note appeared on the door. A simple piece of paper pinned to the wooden surface. "Owner, air out the apartment." A domestic request, polite, without threats or grievances. Just a human reaction to an unpleasant smell. "Air it out, please. It's impossible to be nearby." None of the neighbors called the police. None called the district officer. None even thought that there could be something truly serious behind that smell. A note, and that was it. The neighbor would see it, handle it, air it out, and the problem would solve itself. At some point, a window in the outer wall of the apartment was broken. From the outside, not the inside. The investigation would later establish this, by the nature of the damage. Someone had broken the glass, specifically to ventilate the room and let that smell out into the street. A simple and logical solution from the perspective of a person who doesn't want to investigate the causes but simply wants to get rid of the consequences. Break the window, let it blow out, and you can go on living. Exactly who did it remained unknown. A neighbor who couldn't stand it anymore? A random passerby who smelled it from the street? Or Evgeny himself? Just to be able to exist in those conditions? The investigation didn't find out, and didn't really try, because it was a secondary question. Evgeny was in the apartment all this time. Not in the room where Dasha lay, but in the next one. There was only one habitable room. The second had been empty from the start. No one lived or spent time there. That was exactly where he stayed throughout all those weeks. The apartment by then looked the part. Fast food packaging lay everywhere. Empty beer bottles stood along the walls. Next to them, bottles of Jägermeister, also empty. Cigarette packs lay right on the floor, not in an ashtray, but simply tossed wherever. Filth, trash, total desolation. 3 weeks, 21 days in a row, from December 31st to January 23rd. He didn't leave this apartment. didn't try to hide the evidence or even tidy up, didn't move in with friends or acquaintances, didn't flee the city, although he had plenty of time to do so. He simply existed nearby, through the wall, and conducted a correspondence on Dasha's behalf with her loved ones. The neighbors wrote a note, broke a window for ventilation, and continued with their lives without asking unnecessary questions. The resolution was very close now, but it wouldn't come from the neighbors or random passers-by. It would come from the people who knew Dasha and who could no longer ignore the strange feeling that had haunted them since New Year's. January 22nd. Vladimir Perevoshchikov could no longer wait and convince himself that everything was fine. 3 weeks had passed since he last heard his daughter's voice. 3 weeks of messages that didn't sound like her at all. 3 weeks of promises to call back that were never kept. A phone he was supposedly unable to be brought to because she was sleeping, sick, or busy with something important. Enough, he decided. It's time to handle this in person. He came to St. Petersburg, found the address on Mozhaiskaya Street, went up to the right floor, and knocked on the door of the apartment where his daughter lived with her boyfriend. Silence in response. No one opened, no sounds from within, no movement behind the door. He knocked again, louder, waited a few minutes. Nothing changed. Then Vladimir went down to the courtyard and looked at the apartment windows from the outside, trying to see if anyone was there at all. And what he saw truly frightened him. One of the windows was wide open, and the other had broken glass. The frame hung on its hinges, shards sticking out from the edges of the opening. He didn't immediately realize what this might mean, but he felt scared on an intuitive level. A broken window in January? In St. Petersburg, where the temperature had long been below freezing. Open frames in such weather when any normal person tries to keep heat in the apartment. It was abnormal. It didn't fit into any logic, and he could find no explanation for it. In the evening of the same day, he returned to the house, but this time not alone. He brought a policeman. He found the district officer and explained the situation as best he could. My daughter hasn't been in touch for 3 weeks. I can't reach her. She lives at this address, and I'm very worried about her safety. They went to the door together, knocked, rang the doorbell, and waited for a while. Again, silence. No reaction from inside. The policeman shrugged and said what Vladimir least wanted to hear. Without an official missing person report, he had no right to break into someone else's apartment. There were no legal grounds for such actions. Maybe the person just went somewhere and didn't say. Maybe they didn't want to open the door for their own reasons. Life is full of such situations. Vladimir stood before that closed door and realized with absolute clarity something was wrong behind it. He felt it with every cell of his body. But he couldn't prove anything. He had no facts, only feelings, and a father's intuition screaming that something terrible had happened to his daughter. He went back to where he was staying, took out his phone, and wrote Evgeny one last message, direct and without preamble. If you don't put Dasha in touch with me today, I'm going to the police and filing a missing person report. He sent it, put the phone away, and waited for a reply that might shed some light on the situation. There was no reply in the evening or that night. The phone was silent. Vladimir prepared for the next step. To go to the police station in the morning, write an official report, and demand that the search for his daughter begin. At that very moment, Evgeny Andreev sat in the apartment on Mozhaiskaya Street and read that message on the phone screen. He perfectly understood that the game he had been playing for 3 weeks was coming to an end. Now the father was going to the police, and that changed everything. A missing person report meant a search. A search meant checking the last known address. Checking the apartment meant the end of the entire story. It was too late to run, and there was nowhere special to go. Hiding anything was also pointless after 3 weeks in a warm, closed space. Evgeny made a decision and called his friend, Nikita Leontiev, a lawyer by profession. This call would determine everything that would happen next. The night of January 23rd. 2 or 3 o'clock. The exact time is not specified in the case files. A street near Mozhaiskaya. Dark, cold, almost no one around. 2 men stand on the sidewalk waiting for something. One of them takes out a phone and calls the police. He gives the address and says, "Come quickly. There is a man here who wants to make a statement." The duty officer on the other end of the line clarifies, "What kind of statement? What exactly is this about?" The answer is short, a voluntary confession. The dispatcher asks for descriptions, whom to look for on site. The answer sounds almost absurd for an official protocol. One in a cap, the other without a cap. The patrol arrived in a few minutes and found both of them exactly where they said they would be. Standing, waiting, not attempting to leave or hide. The man without the cap was Evgeny Andreev. The man in the cap was Nikita Leontiev, a lawyer by profession and a friend of Evgeny. Andreev told the police immediately, without preamble, "I want to confess. I took the life of my girlfriend. Her name is Daria Perevoshchikova. It happened on December 31st. She is still in the apartment on Mozhaiskaya." He got into the police car voluntarily, without resistance, without trying to explain himself or take back what he had said. He simply sat down and went, as if he had been ready for this moment for a long time. On the way, he told everything that happened that evening, calmly, steadily, without emotion, as if he were recounting events from someone else's life that did not concern him personally. They argued over money. She said she was leaving him forever. He hit her with a hammer, then strangled her. She was still alive after that, and he finished what he started. Just like that, in a few sentences, he laid out what had happened 3 weeks ago. They drove to the house on Mozhaiskaya. Andreev opened the apartment door with his own key, entered first, and showed the police. Right here, in this room. Dasha lay on the floor in the same place and in the same position as on New Year's Eve. Next to her stood a Christmas tree with ornaments and a garland. The police called the investigative team, and Andreev was taken to the station for processing and interrogation. Now, Leontiev would later tell journalists one important detail. Evgeny had called him back during the holidays, literally in the first days of January. He said that something terrible had happened, that he had done something awful and didn't know what to do now. Nikita didn't believe a single word then. He decided it was just more drunken nonsense, because Evgeny had said strange things before, lied, made up stories about the funerals of living relatives. So why should this time be any different? But Evgeny called again and again over those weeks, insisting that it was true, that he wasn't making it up. Leontiev finally believed him, or decided to check for himself. He came to Mozhaiskaya, saw everything with his own eyes, and realized that the drunken nonsense had turned out to be a monstrous reality. It was he who advised the voluntary confession. It was the professional advice of a lawyer who understands how the system works. If you are guilty, and they will find you sooner or later anyway, it is better to come forward yourself. This is a mitigating circumstance. The court will take the voluntary confession into account when passing sentence. Dostoevskian, Leontiev would say later in an interview, conscience tormented him. Remorse gave him no peace, like in a classic novel about crime and inevitable confession. Maybe that was how it was. Or maybe everything was much simpler and more prosaic. The ultimatum of a father who promised to go to the police the very next day. The local precinct officer who had already knocked on that door the evening before. The realization that tomorrow there would be an official missing person report, and the day after, tomorrow, a search of the apartment with all the ensuing consequences. That same night, Andreev was officially processed, interrogated, and a protocol was drawn up with all his testimony. He signed everything without objection and without attempting to change his words. The justice system was set in motion. The suspect was in a cell. Testimony was obtained and recorded, and a criminal case was opened. Justice seemed only a matter of time, and no one then could have imagined how things would turn out later. That same night, they called Vladimir. He had been expecting anything after that ultimatum, that his daughter would finally call back, that Evgeny would come up with a new excuse, that in the morning he would have to go and write a report. Instead, a voice on the phone sounded, official and dry. Your daughter is no more. Her boyfriend has confessed. She is in the apartment on Mozhaiskaya. She has been lying there since December 31st. All this time, while he was writing her messages, while he was asking about her health, while he was calling Evgeny and listening to his calm voice, Dasha was already gone, and he was being answered by the person who had done it. Vladimir tried to remember. Was there anything he could have noticed? A moment when he should have broken down the door instead of writing messages. He had come there, after all. He stood under the windows. He knocked with the precinct officer. And he left with nothing, because formally, everything looked normal. His daughter was in touch. She was responding, which meant she was alive. Later, after the arrest, Vladimir learned something else. Evgeny's ex-girlfriend reached out herself. She had read the news and realized whom she had been dating. She shared details. After their breakup, Evgeny would not let her go, appearing wherever she went, demanding to meet, asking for another chance. And when she refused, he threatened her. She didn't go to the police. She simply disappeared from his life, changed her number, closed her social media accounts. Vladimir realized the story could have ended differently if someone had told him, if someone had warned him, if he himself hadn't believed those messages. Now it didn't matter. His daughter was gone. Ahead were the identification, the funeral, the investigation, the trial. He prepared to wait as long as necessary. The funeral took place about a month later. Not immediately, because the investigation needed time. Forensic exams, protocols, formalities. Until everything was completed, Dasha was not released to her relatives. The day turned out cold, February. A lot of people came. Friends, colleagues from the barbershop, acquaintances from different periods of her life. Those whose hair she had cut for years. Those with whom she had traveled to Georgia. those who knew her as Dora, as the girl who had been building her own life since she was 17. The casket was closed. After 3 weeks, in a warm apartment, there was nothing to look at. They said their goodbyes to a photograph in which she was smiling. Now, the wake was organized by Gleb, her ex-boyfriend. They had broken up long before Evgeny, but remained friends. He knew how she would have wanted it. Not in the Soviet way, not with vodka and Olivier salad in plastic plates, Prosecco instead of vodka, music that she loved, conversations in a normal, human tone, not in whispers, in her style. Someone called it a punk wake, and the name stuck. Friends remembered different things, stories from the barbershop, her laughter, plans for Tbilisi that many knew about, her stubbornness and strength. And here is what is important. She never complained and never asked for help. She handled everything herself, the work, the money, the men who weren't worth her. This commanded respect, and this is also what destroyed her. If she had asked for help, maybe someone would have made it in time. The father took the cat, the same one for which Dasha had been preparing documents, the one she intended to take to Georgia. Now it will live in Kiev. Evgeny, meanwhile, was in a CISO, pre-trial detention center. A cell, interrogations, everything followed procedure. The case was sent to court, Article 105, Part 1. Up to 15 years. Everyone understood that. Considering the voluntary confession, the sentence would be shorter, but no matter how much they gave him, it would be a sentence. Real prison time, a colony, punishment. The relatives waited for the trial. Friends waited for the trial. Everyone who knew Dasha waited for the moment when the judge would pronounce a number and the guards would lead him away. The system was working. Slowly, with creaks, with bureaucracy, but it was working. Justice was approaching, or so it seemed then. Before starting the trial process, one fundamental question had to be answered. Did he understand what he was doing at the moment when all this happened? Andreev was sent for a psychiatric evaluation at a specialized institution. 2 months of observations, tests, and interviews with specialists. A commission of several people, psychiatrists, psychologists, experts with years of experience. The question was extremely simple. Sane or not? If not, then there would be no criminal punishment in principle, mandatory treatment, a closed clinic, but not a colony. No prison term, no sentence in the sense that Dasha's relatives were waiting for. That is why they waited for the results of this evaluation with such tension. It was the first moment when justice could slip away. If the commission found him insane, then everything would end. No trial, no punishment, a hospital instead of a prison, and a completely different outcome to the case. 2 months of silence. No news, no interim results, no information on how the experts' work was progressing. Only the waiting, which stretched on endlessly. Then the conclusion arrived. Sane, fully aware of the nature of his actions at the moment of their commission, able to direct them and control himself, understood what he was doing and what it would lead to. But the commission noted something else in its conclusion, and it wasn't a disease or a diagnosis, but a personality profile, characteristics that caught the specialist's eyes during those 2 months of observation. Coldness, superficial and shallow emotions, as if he were imitating them rather than truly experiencing them. Formal empathy, or none at all. Muted reactions, as if everything were happening somewhere behind glass and did not concern him directly. Periodically, occurring impulsive emotional reactions, not constant aggression, but specifically outbursts, sharp, unexpected, arising from nowhere and going nowhere, and then a flat line again, as if nothing had happened. Oddity, selectivity in communication, pronounced introversion. Now in official language, this was called personality traits that do not exclude sanity. In human language, he is not insane in the clinical sense. He is just the way he is. Experts in Russian practice do not use terms like sociopath or psychopath. That classification is not accepted here. But the portrait they painted in their conclusion was clear even without those labels. A man who could hit someone with a mallet, go out to the kitchen to smoke, hear sounds from the room, and return to finish what he started. Who lived in the same apartment for 3 weeks and ordered food from her phone. Who corresponded with her father, choosing his words carefully, knowing she was lying in the next room. The case was sent to court. There were no more obstacles to this. The accused was recognized as sane, evidence was collected, and testimony was recorded. All that remained was to set a date for the first hearing and begin the process. The relatives exhaled. The first barrier was passed. Now the trial. Now the sentence. The first hearing was scheduled for spring. A courtroom, benches for the audience, a cage for the defendant, a judge at the table. The judge turned out to be a woman of about 35, quite young for cases of this nature. But that didn't matter much to those who came to this room. 4 people came from Dasha's side. Her father, Vladimir, who had been waiting for this moment since January. Her sister, Elena, who had specifically flown in from Italy, taken time off work, and bought tickets at her own expense. Gleb, the ex-boyfriend who organized the wake. And a friend, one of those who knew Dasha from the barber shop. They sat in the front row, looking at the currently empty cage and waiting for the person they had all gathered here for to be brought out. Andreev was brought out and placed in the defendant's dock. He sat down, folded his hands in front of him, and looked at the floor. He did not raise his eyes, did not look back at the room, and did not react to anything around him. Now, there was no one from Andreev's side. No parents, no friends, no acquaintances, no colleagues, no one at all who came to support him. Empty benches behind him, as if this man had no life outside of that apartment on Mozhaiskaya. Only a lawyer sat nearby, but that is a job for which one is paid, not the support of a loved one. The hearing followed standard procedure, establishing the identity of the defendant, explaining his rights, the prosecution's position, the defense's position. All those formalities that must be observed by law before moving to the heart of the matter and the consideration of evidence. Andreev pleaded fully guilty, without any reservations or attempts to mitigate his actions. Yes, I hit her. Yes, I strangled her. Yes, she stopped breathing. Yes, I lived in the apartment after that and corresponded on her behalf. Everything is as recorded in the case files. I deny nothing. The judge scheduled the next hearing, then another, interrogations of witnesses, study of evidence, speeches of the parties. All of this required time. The process moved slowly, with all the necessary stops and formalities, but it was moving in the right direction nonetheless. Elena flew in for every single hearing without exception, from Italy to St. Petersburg, then back, and so on several times. She took time off work, spent money on tickets, sat in the courtroom, and looked at the man who had deprived her sister of her life. And here is what she noticed. He never once looked in her direction. Not once during all these hearings did he raise his eyes and meet the gaze of anyone sitting in the room. The third hearing ended, and the judge announced the date of the fourth. Everyone understood that the finale was close. A little more, and the closing arguments would begin, then the defendant's final statement, and then the sentence. That very number that would be spoken aloud, and that everyone was waiting for. The relatives were preparing to hear it, preparing to see him led away in handcuffs, preparing to finally exhale. The fourth hearing was scheduled for August 5th. August 5th. The fourth hearing in the Andreev case. Everyone expected that it would be the last, that the sentence would be pronounced today, and this story could finally be closed. Dasha's classmate, the one who had come to her for a haircut at the end of December, sat in the court corridor and waited. He had been called as a witness. He was supposed to tell about their last conversation, about how she spoke of leaving Evgeny, about the words, "He's like a parasite to me," about her decision, which she never had time to carry out. He looked at the door of the courtroom and was nervous. After all, it was a court, official testimony, and responsibility for every word spoken. Then the door opened, and two men entered the hall. The first was in military uniform, an officer, clean, ironed, a peaked cap, shoulder straps, everything according to regulations. The classmate would later describe him to journalists in one phrase: handsome, in a little cap. The second was also in uniform, but a completely different kind. Worn out, clearly not for parade. A man who definitely didn't come from an office. It was visible immediately. Untidy appearance. That's what he would later be called in publications about this case. They passed by the classmate, sitting in the corridor, entered the courtroom, and took the empty seats. Inside, there were already 4 people, the same people who had come to every previous hearing. Vladimir, Elena, Gleb, the friend. The same seats in the front row, the same position opposite the cage with the defendant. They saw these military men enter, but didn't understand why they were here or what connection they had to the case. Maybe some kind of additional security. Maybe a check from the military enlistment office. Courts are state institutions. You never know who goes in there for their own business. It didn't seem unusual. The judge came out and took a seat at the table. Usually, she started immediately, clearly, according to procedure, without unnecessary pauses. This time, something was wrong from the very beginning. The pause stretched out, long and awkward. She looked at the papers in front of her, as if rereading something important. Then she raised her eyes to the room and began to speak, quietly, almost in a whisper, so that those present had to listen intently to make out the words. Elena tensed up, trying to understand what was happening. The judge's words arrived in fragments, not forming a complete picture. Something about the law, something about special circumstances, something about mobilization and the legal norms associated with it. She didn't immediately understand what it was all for and what connection it had to her sister's murder case. The first thought was simple. Maybe this is how all court hearings start now. Some new formality that was introduced recently. They read out something mandatory according to the regulations and then moved to the heart of the matter. The judge continued to speak. Her voice was steady, but still quiet, as if she herself didn't want to say these words out loud. The phrasing was bureaucratic, official, legal. Elena tried to catch the meaning of what she was hearing. Her father sat next to her, also listening, also clearly not understanding what was happening and why the hearing was going so strangely. And then it hit her. Not immediately, not with one specific phrase, but gradually. Understanding came slowly, as if someone were gradually turning up the volume, and what had seemed like background noise and formality suddenly became the only sound in the room, drowning out everything else. She looked at the military men sitting in the hall, at the judge who continued to read something out, at Andreev in the cage. He sat exactly as he always did. No, something had changed. Something that shouldn't have happened. Something for which none of those present were prepared. The judge read out, "The defendant has signed a contract with the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. In accordance with current legislation, the criminal prosecution is suspended. He is being sent to the combat zone." Elena didn't understand these words at first. Then she understood and didn't believe them. Then she believed them. And she screamed. Not words, but a sound. The cry of a person who had just had the only thing she had been flying here for, month after month, taken away from her. Justice, a sentence, anything at all. She jumped up and ran to the glass behind which Andreev sat. "Coward! Look me in the eye! You took my sister's life! You tortured her!" He turned his head. For the first time in all the hearings, he glanced over briefly, emptily, and turned away. Elena was pulled back. She sobbed, screamed something about injustice, about how such a thing was even possible. Her words mixed with sobs. Andreev's lawyer, that same Leontiev who had brought him to the police in January, approached the cage and asked quietly, "When did you even sign the contract?" He didn't know. He hadn't been warned. His client had done it himself, silently, without discussing it with his defense. Now, formally, this was not a verdict, a suspension of the case. It is not closed. It is frozen. If he returns alive, theoretically, the trial will continue. Theoretically. Andreev was led out of the hall, but not in handcuffs, and not under guard to a prisoner transport vehicle. He was simply led out, and he walked down the corridor, a free man, accompanied by those same military men. Dasha's classmate was still sitting there, waiting to be called to testify. He wasn't called. The hearing ended early. He saw Andreev walking past, free, without handcuffs. Their eyes met. Andreev didn't look away. He looked straight for several seconds and walked on, toward the exit, toward the car, toward the war. Now Evgeny Andreev is somewhere out there, at war. There is no contact with him. No one knows if he is alive or not, wounded or healthy, fighting or deserted. If he survives, he will return a hero, a veteran, a man who has redeemed his guilt. That is how it works under the law. If he does not survive, the case will be closed because there is no one to try. Dasha's family fears both options. For 3 weeks, they looked for a living girl. For months, they conducted the case. 4 court hearings, evaluations, interrogations, testimony. The entire machine of justice was working, with creaks, with bureaucracy, but it was working. And then a man in a peaked cap came with a paper in his hands, and the machine stopped. 1 signature, 1 contract, and the one who did it is free. This is not a system failure. This is the system. Write in the comments what you think about this story. If you want to see more of such breakdowns, subscribe to the channel. Until next time.